Gwen Trice was born and raised in La Grande, Oregon. One of the 7 children of Dorothy and Lafayette, better known as Lucky.
My dad came from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. My mom came from Valdosta, Georgia. That's where she was born. They had met when she worked at the PX in Florida, and he was in the Army. And so when they hooked up, and he brought her out to Eastern Oregon.
Lucky was much older than his wife and had been living in Oregon since long before World War II.
I remember hearing a story when I was a little girl. He was changing his clothes, and I saw this big scar on his shoulder. And I said, well, Dad, what happened there? And he said, oh, I was in a logging accident. And I remember looking at it and tracing my hand over it and thinking, wow, that must have hurt. But he never really elaborated on his lifestyle or what he did back then. Over the last few years, I discovered that my father got here in a boxcar. He traveled here when he was 26 years old with his father, and they came here to be railroad loggers.
Lucky Trice had come to nearby Wallowa County to live and work in a small logging community, long since gone, called Maxville.
Well, it was a little different than a typical logging camp because families were there.
Maxville's real distinction, though, lay elsewhere.
It was very unusual that they would have black people in Oregon, actually.
They had the black school and the white school. They didn't go to the same schools, I know that.
Wallowa had a baseball team. Troy had a baseball team. Maxville had 2 baseball teams, a white team and a black team.
They were friends. They worked together well.
It was economics. Dad couldn't get a job as a salesman. Logging was his way of making a living for his family.
I wonder at how my dad felt to have come to a place that was unknown, completely unknown to him, and then to be in this spot that's so remote, against all odds, trying something brand new.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Ann and Bill Swindell's Charitable Trust, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and from viewers like you. Thank you.
My dad, to me, as a little kid, was 10 feet tall, and everyone knew him. His name was Lucky.
Lucky Trice owned a succession of small businesses. He commanded the local American Legion post. He was an active conservationist and an avid outdoorsman.
I was raised on elk and venison and pheasant and crappie that my dad would fish for.
And he just plain loved to fish.
The vacation was we'd take the kids and he'd fish.
Lucky broke new ground for African Americans in an almost all-white part of the state. But he never told Gwen much about his early years.
He was 56 when I was born. He had had this life that I knew nothing about. I think probably the best years were really like first grade or second grade. And I think that was before I really kind of knew that there was a difference between me and the other kids that I grew up with. For the most part, I had some really great friends, but some parents said, well, you can't play with her because she's black. As soon as I got out of high school, I figured I would go and find out what my future would be in the city.
After high school, Gwen moved to Seattle, where she lived and worked for nearly 30 years.
I thought I would never leave that town. I thought that that was going to be the place I would find my answers. But what I realized is I felt like I really didn't quite fit in.
So recently, she moved back to Oregon, to rural Wallowa County. She learned about an old logging town called Maxville. African-American loggers had lived there, up in the hills near Promise.
I'd never even heard of Promise. Someone back home said, well, you know, your people are from up there. You should go up to that reunion. And I thought, well, what do they mean by my people? What does that mean?
Wallowa County was not discovered by the homesteaders until about 1870.
This part of northeastern Oregon is remote, isolated by mountains. Winters can be long and harsh. Life has never been easy for the farmers and ranchers who settled here. The hills were thick with tall old pines and fir trees. But the timber business was all very local until the railroad came.
The railroad really expanded the economy of the valley, and the railroad was built into the Wallowa Valley in 1908.
Lumber companies bought up and logged much of the homesteaded land. A Missouri company, Bowman Hicks Lumber, acquired a large tract of timberland out near Promise. Workers laid railroad tracks up into the hills, brought in small mobile houses, and built a town. They named it Maxville. Then Bowman Hicks imported hundreds of workers from the southern states.
They were both colored and white that came up.
That was in 1923.
Over here, this is all Bishop Meadow, and this is the place they found to be the permanent spot to place the town that used to be Maxville.
Maxville became one of the largest towns in the county. The only African Americans in the county lived here, some 50 or 60 at one time. Their children attended Oregon's only segregated school. Housing was segregated too.
The African Americans, they all stayed on this side of the track. And then the majority of the town, Maxville, was back over here in this part.
Yet in the woods, the black loggers felled trees side by side with the white.
Here's the thing is, they worked it out. They worked it out without having to, for the most part, do bodily harm to one another. You needed to work side by side with that man because he may save your life.
Maxville is a unique but poorly documented chapter in Oregon history. And this is where Lucky Trice and his father, two skilled Arkansas loggers, first traveled out west to work some 80 years ago.
I am just now beginning to understand how they came to be here. But there's a group of people that still exist that know the story.
Promise existed before Maxville, and it endured years longer. Promise people still gather here at the old Grange for an annual reunion. These are the people who best remember Maxville, and this is the community where Maxville made its mark. So Gwen began to talk with them on videotape about those old days. And she asked about Maxville, which had sprung up in their midst.
I just knew I needed to record these voices and I needed to have their stories in a permanent spot. And so I just started talking and asking questions and visiting people. What do you remember about Lucky Trice?
He used to come get my wood in for me.
My husband was very, very fond of him. They logged together.
Lucky was a real good man. If things were bubbling over, he kind of kept the lid on them.
A snag fell over and hit my husband on the back, cut his back up, but didn't break anything. And Lucky picked him up and packed him, I don't know, ran with him quite a ways because to get him where they could take him to the doctor.
I'm just Orland Barton.
And I'm Norman Barton, his older brother.
That's my dad and my uncle. They came all the way from Fayetteville, West Virginia to cut logs here.
I was happy about living in Promise Hill. That was the happiest time of my life. Well, there's a lot of things to do. Hunt. Hunt mushrooms or whatever.
Go fishing.
Chase rattlesnakes and whatever else.
Back then, in those days, nobody knew what a no trespassing sign was.
Everybody helped everybody.
I'm Sylvia Alberta Carper Prince. I was born and raised here in Wallowa County. Mama had all of her children at home and had old midwives. And if they didn't make it in time, Papa took care of the deal.
I'm Marvella Hafer. My dad was a rancher, ran cattle, farmed.
So did your father work at Maxville?
When he was cutting logs, he rode with the black men in the candy wagon into the woods to do their sawing. The expression candy wagon came from the fact that it was to haul the black men, and apparently it came from the fact that the white sawyers called them chocolate drops. I think it was just an expression that came with the company from the South.
Those people were from the South, you know,
Right.
and they were prejudiced.
For many people in Wallowa County, these would be the first African Americans they would ever meet.
So what was the general feeling of the local people when you had a group that was diverse, that was the colored folks that moved in?
Everybody was good. Everybody was nice. And the colored people were just as white as we were. We never showed partiality with nobody. They'd come visit us. And we visited them.
We had a good friend, his name was Nigger Bob, and I don't think anybody here named him that. I think it was just a name that came with him.
Oftentimes the terms that are used for African American people, that's just the way that it was, you know, back during that time. And for me, that's really an honor that the folks are comfortable enough and willing to tell the story like it happened and not doctor it up.
The timber industry was alive and well in the South. From here, more than 400 loggers, railroad men, and family members came to Maxville. They brought their culture and traditions.
Colored boys felled the trees. Some of the white men cut it up so they could be loaded on the trains. And white men also loaded the trains.
The adjustments that were made by the minorities there were that you did what you were supposed to do, you keep your mouth closed, and not step out of line, and you get along fairly well. And these were hardworking people, and this was a chance to make the money here that you couldn't make in the South and try to better yourself.
Maxville generated plenty of new work for local people, too, in the woods and at the mills, and in other ways as well.
That was a new market that didn't exist for the farms and ranchers until Maxville came in, and there was a lot of population there. My dad and his brother would haul a wagon load of produce to Maxville to peddle to the people that lived there.
But the story of Maxville, a company town, has proved difficult to illustrate.
Some people came from Arkansas, Mississippi, Florida, wherever they came from. They left a lot of their family and possibly their family records with them.
Like families everywhere, the established families here photographed mostly relatives.
That's been my biggest challenges, is finding photographs of Maxville and what it looked like in the homes and the African Americans that lived here.
The only map of the town is a modern one, pieced together from memories.
And so you thought the school was up here?
The school was up, yeah, up in here.
Okay.
Alvy Marsh lives in Texas now, but back in the day, he lived and cut logs at Maxville.
Did you have plumbing in the house?
No, they didn't have no plumbing in the house there. Didn't have no lights either.
Alvy's nephew Frank, now a Californian, lived in Maxville as a small child.
That's what our dad did. We were loggers. It was difficult. I remember my mom, she would have to go out and harvest the wood and bring the wood in because Dad would be out logging. She kept the house warm at all times so that my brother and myself would remain warm.
When I lived in Oregon, I said, no, I told him it was nice for work, but I said it wasn't no place for pleasure. Well, you looking for some pleasure, you're gonna have to go somewhere else.
Well, I made him a chocolate, age 96.
As a local teenager, Ada married Angel Metsopoulos, one of the Greek men who maintained the Maxville trains. She and Angel lived in Maxville.
Well, I'll tell you the worst thing.
Okay.
You want the worst?
Yeah, I want the worst.
Okay. Well, I had cornflakes for breakfast. And I was eating away, you know, reading. And when I got down at the bottom, guess what? Can you guess what was it?
I can't even imagine. To the bottom of the bowl?
The bottom of the bowl. Bed bugs.
And was that a problem?
Was that a problem? Bed bugs were a terrible problem up there.
Maddie Wilfong lived in Maxville for 1 year.
It was rugged. Yes, it was. It was rugged. I had to go out and pack water while my husband went out in the woods to cut logs. It was a small place, and it was just like little shacks or something to me. In fact, about the worst place I ever lived in.
Madeline Riggle's husband worked as a crew boss at Maxville.
They would close down and work and let the people have a couple of days to hunt. That was either canned or dried or smoked or something. And, you know, I don't know how we lived. I really don't. Those are hard times, I tell you.
The Wallowa town doctor sometimes braved fierce weather to make house calls out in the woods. And he saw plenty of logging casualties.
There was broken legs, broken bones, injuries of different kinds, and they brought them in.
When you're in the logging woods, you're always in a dangerous situation about every day you go there.
So did you ever hear of any the logging accidents? Did they happen often, or did they?
Oh, they happened quite a bit back then.
And what kind of accidents would those be?
Generally a snag falling and hitting a log cutter.
What is a snag?
It's a dead tree.
I saw a dead tree coming down right on me and him both. It would have killed both of us, just as dead as we ever had to die. And I didn't have time to tell him to move, but he was just like where you is, and I was over here cutting the cutter off. And I just hollered at him, and he moved one way, and I moved the other way, and that tree fell right where me and both of him was sitting.
Over time, Bowman Hicks and others built a network of logging railroads through this ponderosa pine country, with many tall trestles to bridge the canyons.
This area here is, as you can see, it's raised up a bit. This is where the track was laid. I see a structure over there, but I can't tell what it is. Did you hunt?
Did hunt a little bit, but too many people got killed deer hunting out there. Them people from Portland, Oregon would come down there deer hunting, and just time a bush shake, they'd shoot. But about more people got killed than did deer.
I can remember when Maxville and Promise and here in Wallowa, they all had baseball teams. And they would all play each other.
Maxville had 2 baseball teams, a white team and a black team.
During times when they were competing against other groups inside of the county, they would team together and make sort of a super team.
The colored boys and the white boys decided they were going to have a baseball game. They got a little white lightning and put some of it behind first base and some behind third base. And if you got to that base, you could have a drink. Well, they got going along, and pretty soon they started jumping into each other, and they had some broken bones out of that deal. My father put an end to the baseball game.
Today at Maxville, only one structure remains.
The big lodge building is still there. The biggest gathering was a taffy pull-on that they had. Oh, there was taffy pulled across the backs of chairs and tables. My God. Can you imagine pulling taffy and you don't know how many of them washed their hands? Oh.
The Great Depression hit the timber industry hard, and by the early 30s, the Bowman Hicks Lumber Company had cut most of its holdings here. It began to dismantle the town of Maxville.
They took the houses to Wallowa and made homes out of them or made shops out of them. The town just disappeared.
The company pulled up its tracks to Maxville, sold its mill in Wallowa, and moved on. So did most of the Southern workers and their families.
When the black families began to move out, somebody told my mom that one of the ladies had a piano for sale, and that she would want it. So my mom and dad and we kids got in the wagon, pulled by a team of horses, and drove to Maxville. There's 2 black ladies there, and one of them said, well, you need to play it and make sure you like it. And I remember Mom sat down to the piano and she began to play Lord Lift Me Onto Higher Ground. And both of these black ladies jumped up and started singing, just sang to the top of their voice. Beautiful singing.
Several families did stay on, though, in what was left of Maxville. Many fewer children lived here now, and with the company town gone, they all went to the same school, where Madeline Riegels taught.
It was international, they called it, and it was black and white both. They made no difference. There was no question of color.
Look at that. This is the old trestle. This is the last big remnant of that era of the railroad loggers in this area. Look at that. My dad may have been standing right at this very spot. And this was his life. And I get to be in that same space and just maybe be a little closer to the man that I really didn't know till later in his life.
But what started out as a quest for her family history has become something more.
what I thought was going to be my story is really the community's story. To be at the grocery store, the hardware shop, people come up and they say, you know, I've got a story for you. And so you're often hearing different pieces of how your story may fit into theirs. History is really valuable to the community here, and they are really proud of their histories.
I'm going to try to have a Maxville reunion.
Oh, wouldn't that
in a couple of years.
Oh, good.
That'd be fun. Yeah. Maybe sooner if I can get things in order. But sooner the better. Yeah.
There's more about The Logger's Daughter on Oregon Experience Online. To learn more or to order a DVD of the show, visit opb.org. Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Ann and Bill Swindell's Charitable Trust, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and from viewers like you. Thank you.